Welcome to History Repeating, a history talk show where we discuss historical anecdotes you need to know, lest we dare let history repeat itself. I'm your host, Meghan Hughes. Joining me is my co-host, Tim Rapone.
Hi, how
Today
are you?
we are talking about the Iraq War.
Yes. This is going to be a heavy one.
Yeah. It's going to regard discussion of bombing, human rights violations, massacre, sexual assault, and other topics that listeners may find disturbing. So, listener discretion is advised. If you need to tune out, if you are sensitive to that, please feel free to. We will be back again next Wednesday, the 11th, hopefully with a much lighter topic. But this is something that is generally on a need-to-know basis regarding history.
Well, we talked about doing like more of a World War II themed thing last week, but then a lot happened in the past week.
Yeah.
And we figured that the Middle East and Western involvement in the Middle East might be something worth discussing today.
We will try to do so with dignity and respect, especially considering that this is more recent history, and we know viewers might have personal ties and personal connections.
But it's been 20 years now. It is firmly part of...
That's weird. It feels like it's only been like
I think
10.
Many people still think of it as it's like the modern American war, but not anymore. It is a 20-year-old conflict, and the dust has, for Americans, settled, not so much in Iraq.
Yeah. I was born in 2005, so I was born right in the middle of the Iraq War. And while I don't have any necessarily personal connections to it, I didn't grow up in a veteran family. I'm not Iraqi. The sentiment was definitely felt in America.
Yeah, we'll get to all that.
Yeah. You're listening to History Repeating on Hillsborough College's Hawk Radio, live from Ybor City. If you're just tuning in, today we are talking about the Iraq War, and just as a reminder, this will include discussion of bombing, human rights violations, massacre, sexual assault, and other topics that listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised, and if you need to tune out, please do so. We'll be returning next week, Wednesday the 11th, with a much lighter topic of discussion. But for now, we begin our discussion of the Iraq War.
And I think it's interesting starting with such a heavy-handed discussion as we should, because I think to most Americans, they don't realize how heavy this type of war was on the Iraq population, and still is in many ways.
I grew up during, I would say the latter half. I was very young, of course, but definitely there was a lot of anti-war sentiment that I felt I grew up with, especially as someone who grew up with PBS Kids. There was a lot of discussion about world peace, and that was like a very prevalent topic when I was a kid, and I'm not a kid anymore, obviously, but I don't see a huge emphasis on it now. And that's
certainly not right now.
Yeah, purely that's just opinion, but I think definitely when this was happening, there was a lot more. It was a lot more talked about.
I think it was very split down the middle. Depends where you were.
Yeah.
A lot of this was an incredibly annoying show to do research for, because you try going back and you try untangling this mess of the Iraq War, and it seems like nobody can. I mean, this is very recent history. We talked about the Civil War last week. We've had 250 years to decode and decipher that war, and we're still arguing about it. And so you can only imagine a war like the Iraq War. There's really no common consensus on what it was for and what it was about. All that we can say for sure is what they meaning George Bush and his administration, said it was for. Of course, they said that they were going into Iraq because they had evidence that Iraq had WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq had been supporting al-Qaeda, who were responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and that they had to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein as a matter of national security. That was the reason they gave them. However, that sounds nice and simple enough until you get there and you realize that there was no WMDs. They never found any. There was no connection to Al-Qaeda from Iraq. And so then why were we there?
Yeah.
That's the big question then. Why? And then there's even evidence showing that the Bush administration knew that their leads on these matters, on WMDs and Al-Qaeda connections, were weak before the war even started. Because the war started in 2003. Even in 2002, there was a CIA report saying that Al-Qaeda was only monitored by Iraq mostly out of their own concern. There is no evidence at the time being, no reliable evidence that Iraq had been supporting Al-Qaeda. Iraq had been in the news for, at that point, over 10 years, especially since the Gulf War in 1991. Since then, Iraq had been kind of saber-rattling a bunch and threatening. They would always kind of stick their thumb in the UN's nose, and they would frequently say that they have weapons they're not allowed to have, not really nuclear bombs, but like gas bombs and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of concern that Iraq was breaking UN regulations, and for a long time, they were refusing UN inspectors to check their weapons stockhold to make sure they weren't breaking any laws. And because of such, they faced a embargo. But in the early 2000s, Iraq had begun admitting UN inspectors again. And just shortly before the war, they were taking in inspectors, and the George Bush administration actually stopped that inspection from going on. They purposefully removed inspectors from Iraq and sent them back to the UN because they were already at that point in favor of going to war. So there were already inspections going on, and the UN was asking, we need more time to make sure there even are WMDs, and George Bush jumped the gun, and he said, nope, we have to make sure now that they're not doing anything bad through war rather than through inspection, which is a very controversial choice of how to handle that situation, to say the least. A lot of that information comes from I got that from Britannica, the BBC, and a lot of reporting from the time being. Another great thing of reporting on recent history is that the news articles are still up. You can go back and you can still find people talking about this when it was happening.
That is really interesting to do research
in 2003.
I don't remember. I think it was BBC, but when I clicked on the article, it said this article is 23 years old, and I just thought that's really interesting to see. Yeah,
and so this is also when a lot of more skeptical Americans started criticizing, saying the war was over oil. Again, this is recent history. No one can definitively say that we went to war for oil, but this is what I can say. This comes from Foreign Policy in Focus, and this is a report from September 2002. So this is from even before the war started. There was already speculation of Iraq war, and this is what Foreign Policy in Focus had to say. 41 senior British Bush administration officials were former oil company executives or have substantial stock holdings or other financial ties to the oil industry. That's a direct quote from Foreign Policy in Focus. Here's another direct quote. Governments, including Russia, China, and France, have been negotiating with Iraq over plans to develop its oil fields once sanctions are lifted. A resolution of the current crisis, or then current crisis, through United Nations inspections, without a regime change of Saddam Hussein, would allow these negotiations to go forward. This could be contrary to the interests of U.S. oil companies. The Bush administration, in other words, with its extremely close ties to the U.S. oil industry, has an interest in regime change that is forcibly overthrowing Saddam Hussein, that is not related to the concerns over Iraq's development of weapons of mass destruction, basically meaning that forcing out the Saddam regime could have opened the door to U.S. oil companies getting a bigger slice of the pie in Iraq's oil reserves. Again, that is all from 2002. Hindsight is 2020, but there are definitely reasons to suspect that the Bush administration might have had ulterior material motives in going to war with Iraq. Personally, in my belief, and I have seen this thrown around every now and then, after 9/11, the Bush administration was really rocked to its core. They appeared weak in the eyes of many Americans that they cannot protect their own citizenry from probably the most horrific terrorist attack in American history. And so they were antsy for a show of force, is the opinion of many that I personally I can see the merit of, in that a lot of the times wartime presidents tend to have a good incumbency chance. Bush was at that point getting ready for re-election, and many suspect that starting a war with Iraq as a show of force after the horrific 9/11 terrorist attacks was a way to secure re-election. That if he could forcibly overthrow Saddam Hussein, who had been a boogeyman in the United States media for good reason for the past 10 years, would give him basically a good PR rep. Obviously, hindsight, again, is 2020. It did not end up working that way. The Iraq War is very controversial, and many suspect that it might have actually even hurt his chances of re-election, but he was re-elected, and frankly, even if the tactic was flawed, I can personally, this is my opinion now, I do believe that this might have been a way to secure re-election because, while it didn't work entirely the way he suspected, I can see how that would have made sense to him and his administration at the time. Especially because, this is again my opinion, if you listen to George Bush talking, not our brightest bulb in American presidency history. So I can see why he would have thought that would be a good idea. But again, that's my opinion. This is very recent history. There's no way you can really tell whether or not, or really read their minds or come to a direct, concise.
Not to mention, when it gets into presidential politics, it becomes very difficult to differentiate fact from.
That's another problem because the George Bush administration was always either outright lying or outright not fully telling the truth. I mean, they go in, they start the war in 2003 saying there are WMDs or think there are WMDs in Iraq. And then later on they say, never mind, there were none. And then the files get leaked and the reports get leaked. And apparently they never had very good evidence that there ever were WMDs in Iraq. So why were they telling half-truths? Why were they over-exaggerating? There's a lot of inconsistency and uncertainty into why we went to war.
And this definitely had a huge impact on American reaction as well, because I grew up during a time with, and maybe this is also partly due to where I grew up, but growing up in the Tampa Bay area, I feel there was a lot of anti-war sentiment. Protests were very common, though I think that sort of, I wouldn't say died out, but definitely decreased the further into the war that you got. But American reaction was very mixed at the time.
At the start, it was positive. Again, Saddam Hussein, he did lead a very horrific and brutal, oppressive, authoritarian regime over the Iraq people. So not many people are shedding tears over Saddam Hussein getting captured. I'm certainly not. But I guess the point that the message that I see personally when I go through the Iraq War and I see all this inconsistency and all this vagueness as to why we went to war, is that even if you think that it was worth overthrowing Saddam Hussein, even that's your personal opinion, the reason towards war should never be vague. If we're going to war, it should be a last measure resort, and it should be, I think most people would agree that war it's a last resort. It's a horrific resort, and if we are, as a nation, as a democracy, going to move ourselves into war, we need to know precise, clear, concise reasons as to why we're doing this. We talked about the Civil War last week.
Yes.
For the Confederacy, they were very sure why they were going to the war. For the Union, they were sure they had a concise reason to go to war. And
that was also at a very different, stark, contrasting time where America was very avoidant of war or foreign involvement.
Foreign involvement, yes.
Foreign involvement,
war,
yes.
No. America very difficult back then, but
conflict then seemed, unless it was absolutely necessary.
But to your point, World War II and World War I, those were times where America was very isolationist, and yet when we finally did join these wars, we had clear and concise reasons as to why we went there, and everyone knew why. Even World War I, which I think personally was an extremely wasteful and unnecessary war, I can explain to you better why we went there and why other nations went there than I can the Iraq War, which is insane to me. Because World War I, in most people's mind, is like the definition of futile waste. And yet, to me, I can explain that better than the Iraq War because I'm reading all these stories about it, and it's so inconsistent and it's so vague.
For World War I and World War II, the United States government was a lot more transparent on why we were going to war, which makes it a lot easier in hindsight to backtrack what directly caused this war and what caused America's involvement. The Iraq War, we're still feeling a lot of echoes of that involvement, and we haven't fully kind of pieced that together. We're still feeling the effects, and I wouldn't say this is fully history yet, because despite being over 20 years ago now since this started, there is still a lot of confusion in the Middle East, especially regarding American intervention.
And I would like to briefly, before I move on to my next point, or my next coverage of this topic, I'd like to point out just how the war started. At first was a measurement to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime. That started very quickly. That was achieved, I believe, in the first year of the war. They found Saddam Hussein, they captured him, and the regime was overthrown. And that was like the main chunk of the war, and that was achieved by 2004. The war did not end until 2011. So we got Saddam Hussein very early on, and this conflict went on for almost another decade after that. After that point, the war was no longer about overthrowing a regime. It was a military occupancy, and most of the fighting was U.S. soldiers against insurgents. It became an insurgency war. That is an incredibly... If you read about any war, and I'm sure some people listening have read about wars, an insurgent war is incredibly hard. It's guerrilla warfare, and it leads to paranoia. It's hard to train for. It's what Americans did in guerrilla warfare against the British back in 1779, and it's what made Vietnam such a difficult war and also such a horrific war because they didn't know who they were fighting. American soldiers were very paranoid, and that led to them making many mistakes. The most stark example to me is one most people probably don't even know was in the Franco-Prussian War. Prussia, which later became Germany, they invaded France and they conquered Paris. But then, for several months later, after they had beaten the French military, they were stuck fighting against French insurgents that would shoot them behind bushes, out of windows, and it made the German soldiers absolutely terrified that they never even knew where the next bullet might come from. And that fear stuck with Germany so much so that you fast forward 50 years later to World War I, and Germany is invading Belgium illegally. And in their mind, they're just walking through Belgium. They didn't want to go to war with them. In their mind, it's still a dumb reason, but because Germany was still 50 years later so paranoid of insurgents from the Franco-Prussian War, it led them to commit some of the most horrific atrocities of that war against the Belgian populace because they were afraid that Belgian citizens were going to take up arms against them. And so many innocent Belgian civilians were massacred by the German military because of that extreme paranoia of insurgents. And then when we talk about more of the personal experiences in the Iraq War, I think you'll see that same type of paranoia against the American people, and again, or against from the American soldiers against the Iraqi people, that made this conflict so incredibly messy and so horrific to so many people. I'd like to talk about now some of the things that happened during the Iraq War, because again, we know now, or at least from my research of this event, this war going into it, the reasons were very uncertain, unsteady, and it begs the question: is it worth doing this? And because this is what war isn't just pitched battles, especially not an insurgency war. It's not just pitched battles. One of the biggest controversies was the opening of, or the continued use of, the Abu Ghraib prison torture center. It was a prison that Saddam Hussein had used to torture and incarcerate political enemies of his own. And then when America occupied Iraq, they took over that prison and they began to use it themselves for their own purposes. This is a direct quote from Center for Constitutional Rights. Soon after the occupation and the ensuing insurgency, the U.S. began a mass roundup of Iraqi civilians, the vast majority of whom were never charged with any crime, and set up a prison system around the country. Abu Ghraib, a notorious prison outside of Baghdad, previously used by Saddam Hussein's regime to deploy torture and cruel treatment, was opened as a key detention site to hold Iraqi men, women, and children. Inside that sprawling detention center was a 2-floored concrete prison, the hard site, where Iraqis were detained, interrogated, and ultimately tortured. This is a quote from Ali Shalal Qaisi from Al Jazeera, a media network from Qatar. He was someone who was tortured in this prison. I guess I can't read the full quote out loud. It's a little too much, but he describes being blindfolded, electrocuted, humiliated sexually. Most of the prisoners were kept naked and mocked and humiliated. His hands suffered permanent damage from the electrocution torture he underwent. And I'm only going to read part of this quote from him. Women were put on the sector to our left on the second floor. We heard their cries. The guards used to get a male detainee to serve them food, but on one condition, he should serve them food while he is fully naked. We used to hear their screams, and there was a guy called Frederick who used to harm them. We could not help them. We could not do anything for them. Some of us were banging heads against the wall, wishing that we do not want this to happen again and again and again. Occupation is the worst shape of terrorism, crushing the dignity of people and destroying countries. There's later on photos leaked of this prison and the condition of soldiers. There was a huge controversy in the media, and ultimately only 11 people were convicted for it.
Around what time was this?
This is around 2005.
That was not very far into the war at all.
No. And that's what I mean about this insurgency and this paranoia. These are civilians. These are not terrorists being locked up. Anyone they suspected of being an insurgent was locked up and put in this prison and unjustly tortured. And the justice system set up by the military many have criticized, did not do a full, thorough enough job, which is another reoccurring theme that I found in researching this topic, because the American military and American government under the Bush administration and continuing into the Obama administration was not very open about what they had done in Iraq. In 2010, about 400,000 leaked Army field reports were leaked by WikiLeaks, and more than 15,000 civilians were unreported deaths. They originally, they have a direct quote here. Somewhere I do.
Just as a reminder, if you're tuning in, our topic of the Iraq War regards discussion of bombing, human rights violations, massacre, sexual assault, terrorism, and other topics that listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised, so if you're just tuning in and that is not something that you wish to hear, feel free to tune out. Please do so. We'll be returning next week, Wednesday the 11th, with a much lighter topic of discussion.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. This is really rough, but we're getting somewhere with this. Here we go. This is from The Guardian. U.S. and U.K. officials insisted that no official record of civilian casualties existed, but the leaked logs that were recorded by the U.S. military and leaked in 2010 recorded 66,081 non-combatant deaths out of a total of 109,000 fatalities. 66,000 were civilians, 23,000 were classified as enemy, 15,000 were members of the Iraqi security forces, and 3,771 dead were U.S. and allied soldiers. So again, this is what I mean about non-transparency. The American government and the British governments were saying we don't have reliant records on civilian casualties, and yet here we are again with the evidence showing that they were keeping track of what was going on, and they were lying about it. And the question is, why were they lying? And no one has a good answer for that, which is very upsetting to hear, especially when you hear the conditions that a lot of these people that were being put through this were being kept in. Another event from the war that was very difficult to learn about was it was called the Nisour Square Massacre, also known as the Blackwater Massacre, because it involves Blackwater, a private military company that the U.S. was contracting to help in the occupancy of Iraq. They mistook a mom and her son in a Kia as a car bomb, and they opened fire on civilians, thinking that they were part of a terrorist attack on them. And a law issued by the American authorities in Iraq before the United States handed over sovereignty to Iraqis, known as Order Number 17, gave companies like Blackwater immunity from Iraqi law. The people responsible for this massacre did not receive, and this comes from the New York Times, by the way, none of them received any sentences until about 2018, 2019. Some were sentenced up to 30 years, and others were sentenced up to life. In 2020, President Donald Trump pardoned all of them, and they are still free to this day, after opening firing on a crowd of Iraqi civilians and killing 17. Again, this just highlights how reckless the handling of the Iraq War was at times, and again, over a cause that was so vague and uncertain.
So what technically signified the end of the Iraq War?
America pulled out. Obama, in 2010, ordered pulling out, and the last soldiers left in 2011. At that point, there was no big battle or anything. It was just America had, quote-unquote, set up a democracy in Iraq, and they had been overseeing it, and it was dragging on too long, and we pulled out. Another example from this war was known as the Al-Fallujah massacre. Three protesters were shot by U.S. soldiers after the soldiers said they were fired upon. Human Rights Watch did an investigation on this in 2007 when it happened. And this is a direct quote from them. Human Rights Watch did not find conclusive evidence of bullet damage on the school where U.S. soldiers were based during the first incident, placing into serious question the assertion that they had come under fire from individuals in the crowd. In contrast, the buildings across the street facing the school had extensive evidence of multi-caliber bullet impacts that were wider and more sustained than would have been caused by the precision fire with which the soldiers maintained they responded, leading to civilian casualties that day. Human Rights Watch also asserts that U.S. authorities failed to equip or adequately train the troops, primarily paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division, for the complex law enforcement tasks of military occupation. U.S. military and political authorities are also to blame for placing combat-ready soldiers in the highly volatile environment of Al-Fallujah without adequate law enforcement training and crowd control devices, the report said. Even translators were lacking. And one more, then I'm done. The Ashaki massacre, U.S. forces entered a village thinking that there were al-Qaeda supporters there, rounded up and shot 11 people, 5 children and 4 women. They insisted that they did not shoot them, that they had died in a fire shortly after. But the Iraq police reopened the investigation years later, and autopsies confirmed that all 11 victims were shot in the back of the head. These are the things in war that a lot of people don't know about. They don't think about, they don't hear about. And it's something when you go to war, you always have to consider. Again, we need a reason to go there. We need to be prepared to go there. I don't see any preparation. I don't see any solid reason. And it's a controversial topic to this day.
It's something that's lived to this day, for sure. And
I think when you think of war, America hasn't had an attack on its soil from another nation during war since Pearl Harbor. 9/11 comes close, but that wasn't an act of war. But that was probably the biggest attack on a native soil since Pearl Harbor. And before that, America really hadn't had a war on its soil since the Civil War. America is very lucky in that sense that they don't really have this collective remembrance of what war is like. And yet, so stories like this, they're just stories, words on a piece of paper or voices over a radio show. But these are the lived experiences of what happens when you go through war. And now I think, moving on from that, we'd like to mention that this past week, 165 schoolgirls and staff were killed in an airstrike led by United States and Israeli military forces. And, we don't feel that it's appropriate to give another music break in such a heavy topic. And instead, we would like to dedicate the next 60 seconds to a moment of silence for the 165 that lost their lives this week.
Thank you for taking that moment of silence with us. We understand that this episode is a very heavy and possibly disturbing topic for many, but we didn't want to give what's the word? Like a condensed version that doesn't accurately highlight the atrocities that were committed.
An easy pill to swallow.
Yeah. That's why we do this show, is we want to talk about the rough parts of history, not because they're rough, but because these are the bad things that have happened. We don't want to repeat that.
And as part of a democracy that we all live in, these are the things that we should know. These are the mistakes
Agreed.
that have happened in the past that we should be aware of, so that we can ask, how do we make sure that this never happens again? How do we make sure that in the next week another school isn't bombed, that we don't have mistakes happen like what happened in the Iraq War again? How do we make sure that next time we are in a war, which hopefully should never happen, that we do a better job?
And while we aren't an opinion-based show, we can all agree that war is bad. That is probably the bottom line of anything. War is dark and grim and horrific, and if we can avoid it, uncomfortable. It is very uncomfortable, especially to talk about.
I think one of my biggest issues was that I think war has become very comfortable for a lot of people through movies and TV and even hobbies like Civil War miniatures are like a fun little hobby, and I'm not hating on that. I love that stuff.
It's different when it's 250 years ago versus when it's 20 years ago.
But even back then, the Civil War was also more than just pitched battles and a little miniature field, and that stuff can be fun and interesting, but we always have to take a moment to remember what really happens in situations like these and the people that get caught up in it, because it always happens. There's never a war that is just fought in pitched battles. There's always someone else who is caught up in it who doesn't want to be caught up in it, and that can never be forgotten.
Before our show ends, we're taking the time to talk about one more topic on a very lighter note. During Bush's final months of presidency, he attended a conference in Baghdad, Iraq, and I'm sure many of you have seen the, I would argue, historic clip of shoes being hurled at George W. Bush's head. If you have not, on the 14th of December, 2008, journalist Muntatar al-Zaidi threw both of his shoes at President Bush in protest at the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And as he was hurling the shoes, he shouted, translated from Arabic, "This is a farewell kiss from the Iraqi people, you dog. This is from the widows, the orphans, and those who were killed in Iraq." And what's interesting to note about this story is that it was such a pivotal moment, not just in Iraqi culture, but in anti-war sentiment internationally, that it was considered a very historic moment. Unfortunately, the leather shoes that he hurled were eventually destroyed by both U.S. and Iraqi forces. So they aren't sitting in a museum. But there have been many memorials, or not memorials, but very many tributes to the dramatic gesture.
It was a cathartic release.
It was.
You don't see that very often.
According to a New Era, the cobbler who supposedly or claimed to have made his shoes received 1,000 orders in a single week via an article in the Washington Post. It's one of those things where
it was very fitting.
Yeah.
He wasn't hurt. It was just a shoe.
Yeah.
But
I should mention he successfully ducked both shoes, and the journalist, the one who threw them, was injured while being detained, and was detained for 6 months, but has now gone on to talk about that. And
he's still an activist to this day for Middle Eastern freedom and rights, and Yeah.
Can be compared
one of the more
to
comedic
David and
moments
Goliath
of American politics, and very humbling. At the end of the day, these presidents aren't gods; they're just people that we've given a job to, and I guess he thought he didn't do a very good job, so he threw his shoes at him.
It's not something I want to say is funny, but
it is funny.
Having shoes thrown at you and having many more protests follow in suit is a little funny. And I think it's worth discussing.
Yeah.
Looking back on this topic.
And I think, do you want to talk about the protests and stuff a little bit? Because I have a few thoughts on the American reaction to the Iraq War.
Yeah. When I was doing research into this, I found a lot more resources detailing British protests, ironically.
Yes, people don't remember how involved Britain was in this war.
Britain was very involved. And there was a lot of anti-war sentiment that was shared in Britain as well from civilians. Not so much from Parliament, but from...
There was a big outshowing for anti-Bush, anti-Iraq war sentiment, but at the same time, there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, you grew up in a very anti-war period or area. You said, I did not. The sentiment where I grew up in like basically white picket fence, middle America in Massachusetts. The sentiment of the Iraq War that I remember, it was no one really talked about it. I know someone. One of my family members. Yeah. I have a family member who died in the Middle East. A soldier. I only met him about once or twice, and even still, no one really talked about the Iraq War. And
it was something that wasn't extensively explained to me, but it was something that.
And how could you? I mean, yeah. And many adults couldn't wrap their heads around how do you tell a child that? And
but I was told it was happening, that there was war, and of course, being extremely young, I totally misconstrued what that meant at the time. I thought it meant war was happening on our soil. But that is another thing, is that we should be fortunate, so fortunate that America has not.
And that should make us more cautious to ever bring war to someone else's soil.
Yes.
And one thing I heard a lot growing up was the phrase, support the troops, not the war. And that's, perfectly fine phrase, but I think it was almost repeated like a prayer to kind of shrug off any responsibility for the war, as if it's just Bush doing it, and so there's nothing we can do about it. And I personally don't know if that sentiment is all that helpful in a democracy where we should all, be more. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. We should all be more engaged in what our government is doing and making sure that, again, it's a government by the people, for the people. So we should make sure if there is a war going on that we are able to stop it if we don't agree with it, and to make sure that our government is acting responsibly across seas.
And we want to thank you guys for sticking with us for...
A few more minutes, right? We got, I think.
We want to thank you guys for sticking with us through such an uncomfortable show. We understand that, especially if this is personal to you, we know this is not easy to hear. And again, we hope to highlight some lighter topics in the future. But during such a difficult time...
We'll take a break next week for something a bit lighter.
We want to talk about something that is very important. And the core of our show is talking about history that you need to know so that we don't let it happen again. The bad parts. And this was definitely a bad part. So now that you know a little bit more about the Iraq War, because we just barely touched the surface, do what you will with this information, and live your life according to it, I guess. Knowing this, I think, helps make us better people.
Of course. I think, this is the stuff that we need to consider when we're talking about war and invasion. Things like these massacres, these torture prisons, these are outcomes that we need to be aware of that could happen, and we need to make sure that they never happen again. And that when they do happen, that people are held accountable, which is not always the case.
It's definitely something to think about. So thank you again for understanding and sticking with us through this uncomfortable show.